direct the Workforce and Family Program, and I'm grateful that you've braved the weather to be with us today for this discussion of bringing back rural America, policies to help small communities in forgotten places. We're very pleased to be joined by Patrick Carr, who is the Assistant Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and among other things, the co-author of Hollowing Out the Middle, which is the excellent book which we have available here outside. You'll see I've greatly appreciated, as has many people in the media, Patrick and his co-author Maria's work in this area that frankly is under the radar. Many communities throughout our country have had exodus of talent. Many communities have clearly lost jobs in the heartland of our country, and many areas have greater challenges, and many rewards of the cities have drawn many away from their smaller communities. As somebody who grew up outside of Dayton, Ohio, my part of Ohio is hard hit on a number of areas, and I can relate to a lot of what I read in Patrick and Maria's work. On the other side, there are potential solutions, and there are great promise for the heartland, as many parts of our coast face all sorts of other challenges, and perhaps some of the country's future lies in some of these forgotten communities. And to help us think about that, Patrick and I are also pleased that Phil Longman, who is one of New America's bright thinkers and is the Senior Research Fellow for our Economic Growth Program, is also with us today to talk about some of the trends of smallness and other policies that might be able to help small communities. So as we think together about our rural communities and some of our forgotten places, we'll be having some opportunity after our two speakers for us to engage in some Q&A and dialogue, and I look forward to your perspectives as well. So thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Patrick Carr to the New America Foundation. Patrick?
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to everybody who showed up on such a murky, grey day. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and the study, and I'm going to hopefully focus specifically on some of the ideas and policy perspectives at the end. I want to just say at the outset, we didn't discover this hollowing out crisis, if you like, nor do we have all the magical solutions. The goal with the book and with all the kind of subsequent presentations has been to start a conversation, and we hope that today is part of that larger conversation. So some acknowledgments before I go on. My co-author spouse, and I would absolutely swear on a stack of Bibles, the brains of all of this, so is Maria Cavalis, who can't be here because she's 8 months pregnant and not willing to take on Amtrak at this stage, and I don't blame her. Our sponsors were the Transition to Adulthood Network of the MacArthur Foundation, and we had wonderful research assistants, some of the young people who worked with us at St. Joe's and Rutgers, and also the people of Ellis, which is the pseudonym for the small town where we did our research. Some broad trends that just give you a sense of what this crisis is, and again, these are the broad brushstrokes. Demographically, again, here the quick hit trends are between 1980 and 2000, more than 700 non-metro counties lost 10% or more of their population, mostly due to outmigration and mostly young people. And then, so add to the sort of out-migration between 2000 and 2005, you see natural decrease in many of those same counties, in fact more altogether. 800 non-metro counties had more deaths than births. As this happens, then the population ages, the tax base diminishes, and in many ways the sort of the final harbinger of a town that is pretty much hollowed out is when there aren't enough kids to keep a local school open, or when school consolidation happens, which happens in a lot of different places. Okay, here's a quick map. It's a wonderful USDA map of the decimation of the heartland, and you can again see not just where it happens, but just the extent of it. It's really quite an extensive crisis. Some of the notions here, just to again put the implications of this, we found that there are striking parallels with the urban crisis, although this has taken place much more slowly, and as David mentioned at the outset, pretty much under the radar. There are extraordinary sort of parallels to the urban crisis in the sense that the implications and the causes of hollowing out. For example, the global market shifts, deindustrialization, depopulation, the flight of the middle class, and so on. And in many ways, this is also the flip side of the creative class thesis. Is, you know, if you have towns like Austin or, you know, Napa Valley or the Research Triangle that have gained from the sort of influx of creative class people and entrepreneurs, you also have these places that they left to begin with. So there are winners and losers in terms of the creative class. And again, more largely, again, this sort of pool of shrinking opportunities, which I'll return to a little bit later on. Why should we care? This is a question that was asked of us as we wrote this book. You know, well, so what? You know, if towns die, and is this not just a natural occurrence? Is this not just a boom and bust cycle, as, you know, with frontier towns in the 19th century? Well, we don't think so for several reasons. First and foremost, the pace of this is very, very different. A boom and bust occurs rapidly, so a town expands rapidly and contracts just as rapidly. This is something that takes place very, very slowly over a period of time. And it also, as you can see from the sort of the decimation map, is fairly widespread, and much more widespread than just sort of the dotting of frontier, you know, boom towns that die. More specifically, 1 in 5 Americans live in non-metro areas. The consequences of the rural crisis, if we again adopt the same sort of Wilsonian analysis that it's, you know, akin to the urban crisis, are pretty much similar. So you have, you know, the spread of drugs, you've got decline, underground economy, joblessness, and so on. All of these social ills that are there in rural areas, and because they're more widely spread out geographically, they're not as visible as, say, the urban ills would be. This is also the place where most of our food comes from. It's also a place that sends more than its fair share of young people into the military. Small towns in particular are wholly overrepresented per capita in those who sign up to join the military. So, you know, on the flip side of it, then I'll be talking a little bit later on about some of the possibilities of small towns being ground zero for the green economy, for sustainable agriculture more generally. Okay. A little bit about the study, and I'll be fairly brief about this. This was originally a study of young adults, sort of chronicling the coming of age in a small town. It was funded by the MacArthur Network on Transitions to Adulthood. It was part of a larger national study where this was the sort of small town counterpart to big coastal cities, to Midwest metro areas, and so on. And what we wanted to do was talk to young people who had attended this local high school to graduate in the sort of late 80s and early 90s. So basically two groups of young people, mainly in their mid-20s and late 20s, to sort of see, you know, how do they transition to adulthood, how does that compare to other people. We interviewed young people in 15 different states. We lived in this small town on and off for 6 months. We spent 18 months in total basically crisscrossing the country and talking to people. And what we found out was that the coming of age story has larger implications for small towns, and the coming of age story for anybody in a small town centers on two main questions that you have to answer when you're about 18 or 19. Do you stay or do you leave where you come from? And if you leave, do you ever come back? You know, that's a question that gets answered a little bit later on in the early 20s usually, though not exclusively. And we found that by sort of focusing on those two questions, we kind of opened the door to sort of the future of small towns more generally. And that's kind of how we came to write this book. Again, the two cohorts, as I said, those who entered high school to graduate in 1991, 92, and those who entered high school to graduate in 95, 96, 97. We took the entry classes because we wanted to capture people who had dropped out of high school and so on. And again, we caught up with people pretty much all over the country. And to that we owe the undying gratitude to the school secretary of this town. One of the great sort of research advantages of working in a small town is if you get in with the school secretary, she knows pretty much where everybody has gone and can contact people. And so we got, you know, surveys back from people in Okinawa and Alaska. We even got one from a federal penitentiary where the guy used his own money to pay for the stamp because he couldn't receive a stamp because it was contraband. So we're fairly confident that we sort of got a flavour of this population of young people, and then we we did over 100 in-depth interviews with them. So what we did was we identified then several pathways that these young people, and I'm just going to fast forward through this if you don't mind, and there we go, that they take as they answer these questions: do you stay, do you go, and if you go, do you come back? And there are three main pathways. There are leavers, people who leave, and those are two subgroups of the achievers and the seekers. There are stayers, who never go, who stay in their small towns. And there are returners, of which the larger group are boomerangs, people who circle back after a short period of time. And a smaller group are high flyers, very highly sought after, professionally qualified people who come back to small towns. And what we found is overall, the overall sort of take-home message of the research was that small towns play, in some ways, a surprising but a very real, strong role in setting people on these trajectories. That in many ways, small towns kind of sow the seeds of their own decline. So let me just do a quick portrait of these different groups, and then talk a little bit about some of the implications and the policy recommendations that we have that I guess will form the basis of our discussion today. So our achievers, we found that the young people who leave to go on to college and who most likely will never come back are carefully selected, they're cherry-picked, they're carefully cultivated, they're identified very early on, and they receive a disproportionate amount of sort of community resources in their preparation, in terms of what they receive at school, what they receive from parents, from community members. And we call this sort of the triaging of the talented. And this is something that has always happened in small towns. It's just that now the implications of expending all of your resources on those most likely to leave and not come back can be severely debilitating for small towns, as I'll show a little bit later on. So the achievers, they dominate the social world of the high school. They're college-bound pretty much exclusively. Most of the achievers we spoke with attended some of the flagship universities in the state of Iowa or elsewhere. And the sort of going to college becomes a staging ground for, answering that second question, do you ever come back? And the answer for achievers is normally no. Okay, so it's sort of a practice that and there's a certain ambivalence that, these young people who are achievers spoke to us about, the fact that they don't ever see themselves going back to their town. But the longer they're away, the more realistic they become. So the older achievers that we spoke with kind of say, well, I did feel bad initially, but it's just something that's taken me away. And as I said before, the adults really cultivate these young people and cultivate them very strongly. So, for example, most achievers don't work during high school. They're focusing on extracurriculars that are going to help them get into good universities. Most achievers are, steered into the extracurricular activities, National Honor Society, choir, orchestra, again, that are going to parlay into, successful college applications. So just to give you a flavor, and I wanted to just throw in some quotes, of the real voices to give you a sense of these young people. So Ella, for example, and one of the themes was, again, these achievers, it's the whole town has your back. Again, this idea of a collective cultivation. So Ella speaks of really being set forth to do good things. So she says, I felt like I had a lot of people who were really hoping that I would go on and do good things, and that I had a lot of potential, and I think that probably left a deep impression on me, that I'd been embraced by the community and kind of set forth to do something with what I'd been given. So it's almost like a manifest destiny that these achievers seem to have, because that's how they're socialized. Rose also talks about there were definitely popular kids whom the teachers treated differently. I was fairly popular. The teachers were always, it's like elitist. I mean, I could always do anything. I didn't, but I got away with stuff that I know I shouldn't have, that the other kids couldn't have. So again, there's this sort of favoritism and selective socialization that happens for the achievers. Seekers, we found that of the average graduating class over the previous 15 years that we had done, we started the research in 2001, 2002. So we took the previous 15 years of graduates of Ellis High School, and between 5 and sort of ranged from 5 to 10% of each graduating high school class entered the military. So the military was a very well-worn path out of small towns, and so the group that we call the seekers really are those young people for whom college, the four-year college, isn't an option. Either they're just not academically inclined, or they just don't receive the kind of careful cultivation that the achievers do. But they want to get out. They want to go and see the world. They want to see, what's out there. And for them, the sort of the default path is often the military. There are also those who join the military because, they've gotten into trouble, and the military is a sort of a way to sort of salvage themselves in such a way that, one young man spoke, for instance, of, having a bad name, that his family had a bad name, and if he stayed in this town, then, this would just kind of repeat itself, and that being in the military was something that helped save him. So just to give you, again, a flavor of how some of these seekers, Jason, who's a Navy seaman, talks about if he had stayed, and he says, I would have done the same thing as the guys I grew up with and married the girl down the street or one of my classmates from a grade below or above. Every time I come home to visit, when I have a leave, I see my classmates doing the same jobs they were doing in high school, living in the same places. They haven't done anything. I've been halfway around the world a couple of times. I've done all kinds of different things and lived all over the United States. Been and done so many different things that these people will never do. So again, this very powerful wanting to get away, but not being the ones that are sort of chosen or set out to do that, and using the military as a way to do that. As I mentioned before, a recent report for the Carsey Institute shows how overrepresented small towns are, the young people in small towns are in the military. And some of the conclusions of that, and I could talk a little bit more in the Q&A because I'm rushing through things here, about some of these people when they come back after serving in the military and how let down they feel. But these sort of higher fatality rates result from the fact that basically there are more people from small towns in the Army, mainly because the opportunities just aren't there. Again, and they couch it beautifully in the sort of transition to adulthood, sort of that just those opportunities aren't there. So the Army becomes a default employer. But it kind of has been, for this town anyway, historically, this has been the case. Okay. The young people who stay. A guidance counselor who'd worked in the local high school for about 20 years, when we talked to him, put it this way. The best kids leaves, and the one with the most problems stay, and then we have to deal with their kids in the next generation. Which has been a comment that in this small town, I visited 2 weeks ago. I did a talk, and people were incredibly teed off about that particular comment, but he did say it. And, so the stayers, these are the guys for whom a generation ago things were okay. There was a fairly vibrant or robust agro-industrial economy. It didn't matter that small towns invested so much of their resources in the guys who were leaving, because the guys who were staying had some good options. So the economy was much stronger for them. It's not anymore. Those opportunities aren't there. There's been massive farm consolidation all over the Midwest. In this county where Ellis is situated, again, you can see that the average farm size has almost doubled in the last 12 years. So, there's this kind of amalgamation to the mega farms. There's been a consequent sort of contraction in manufacturing, which again was one of the sort of fail-safes for these young people. And even the jobs that are there, the young people who are stayers spoke very pointedly about doing jobs that if they'd been hired under a different contract, they might earn $15,000 more, or doing the same job as a guy down the line and getting paid much less for it, or doing the same job at 24 they did at 18 and earning less and having fewer benefits. So you can see how both the amount of opportunities and the quality of those opportunities is severely constricted for these young people. So they're pretty much trapped in a faltering economy, and because the achievers get so much of the attention, so much of the investments, nobody really invests in these guys, and yet they are the ones who stay, right? So stayers talk very beautifully about work and the value of work in their lives, and work as being something that they were born to do. Unlike the achievers who don't work during high school, stayers work a lot. So by the time they're 15 or 16, some of them are working more than 30 hours a week, and they're earning good money. They're earning good money for a 16 or 17-year-old. And this is the sort of, it becomes almost a great betrayal that, I'm earning a paycheck that a 25-year-old earns. oh, but then when you're 25, oh, I'm still earning the same paycheck, and it's this kind of betrayal that, you know, if I work hard, and, you know, again, the average work week for some of these guys, when we did our survey back in 2001, the average work week was 58 hours a week for many of these stayers, which, you know, is very, very high. You know, again, very much contrast to the other groups in the sample. So, you know, again, this idea that work was something I was born to do, and this pride in your work ethic, but something that eventually kind of, you know, undoes them or betrays them. And here are some of just some quotes. So Jason says, you know, it really gets under my skin to do the same thing another guy's doing. He has more seniority. He was hired under a better union contract. He makes $20,000 or more a year than me. We're doing the same stuff. You know, it's tough to swallow that we're going to be the first generation that does worse than our parents. And again, this, you know, very sort of pointedly done. And then on the skills mismatch, these guys were very aware that, you know, part of it too is probably a cohort effect in the sense that they came of age so they sort of missed a lot of the sort of technology changes that maybe they, you know, would have had more skills in high school than they did at the time. But they're very, very aware of this. So Trevor talks about nowadays everything is so much computers that you're either going to be a laborer or you're going to be on your butt behind a computer. You got to do one or the other, and if you're not good at reading and writing like I am, you better learn some of these alternatives. So again, the sense that you know, they need these skills and they're not getting them. I'm just going to fast forward through to the returners. The average returner, we call them the boomerangs. They're people who go away for a short period of time. They're curious about the world, but it's a temporary leaving. They're more likely to be, the stayers are more likely to be young men. The average returners of boomerangs are more likely to be young women. If they go to college, they usually go and get an associate's degree. They come back. Many of them marry stayers. They work in sort of pink-collar, white-collar jobs. And, you know, sort of, again, settle down in these towns. And again, just some of the quotes and words from these young people. So Madeline, who's a community college grad, so she says, you know, maybe if I'd grown up in a big city like Minneapolis, I would have wanted a 4-year college degree and a career. But I don't want to even try to be a superwoman. I'd rather hang out on the floor with my kids. Taylor, again, another community college grad. I see my friends that have left. You know, one of my girlfriends went off to Harvard to college and lived in the city. And, you know, she's so different from when she was in high school because she's had culture. When you live in Ellis, there is no culture here. I mean, it's just plain small-town America. And I think that, you know, you don't know who you are. I think there's a lot more life out there than what else people know. So again, there's a sense among some of these, you know, young people, young women, that there's something lost, right? These are the guys that small towns really want. A very small percentage, in our study, less than 1 in 10, probably 1 in 15 of the achievers come back. And they come back after, you know, finishing a professional degree, or they come back as entrepreneurs because they've made money elsewhere. And these are, you know, really that small towns kind of really, you know, they want these guys. And in a lot of places there are a lot of policies put in place to entice and induce these so-called high flyers to come back. And that is the predominant approach, to offer more incentives. They're very, very important to small towns, but the strange thing is, what we found with the high flyers is that they really don't act rationally or in any sort of economic sense. It's not about enticements. It's not about incentives with these guys. If they do come back, they come back for intensely personal reasons. So a quintessential high flyer is this woman, Liz Volker. She's a doctor. She's just the, you know, kind of high flyer every small town wants. She's active. She's involved in the church, the community. She does all these, you know, volunteer things. And, you know, but she talks about how when she did come back to a town very close to Ellis, but, you know, similar small town, she turned down a job offer in Des Moines that would have paid her twice as much as she's paid now. And she says, probably the biggest motivating factor in returning was my family. I wanted to be close to my extended family. I chose to stay here because I wanted to raise my children here. I enjoy Iowa. So again, it's very hard to legislate for such intensely personal choices. Okay, so here's the meat. What can we do? This sort of emptying out, the hollowing out, is simultaneously a symptom and a cause of this sort of rural decline. The process showcases how young people who remain in return are in danger of being left behind. And we really believe that any change must combine change at both the local level, at the micro level, and at the more macro or national, certainly national and possibly state level policies. So let me just give a quick summary of some of the policy changes, and I'm happy to talk about these in more detail in Q&A. Okay, so the micro level changes. First and foremost, we believe that because there is such an inequality of investments across young people at the level of a small town, that some strenuous effort has been made to really reimagine education, to reimagine the allocation of investments. Again, putting all your eggs in the basket that's most likely to sort of go and not come back doesn't really make a whole hell of a lot of sense. So investing in the stayers and in many of the returners as much as is invested in the achievers, and in different ways, as I'll explain in a minute, is a sensible first step. Alongside that, and in step with that, need to revamp education to prepare young people for opportunities in growth areas. State of Iowa, for example, does have job growth areas in biotech, in health and nursing, in wind and alternative energy more generally. And these are the kinds of sort of opportunities that the stayers that we spoke with are really ill-equipped to. They're not equipped to be able to take up those opportunities. Key in all of this are, we believe, the community colleges, linking up high schools with community colleges in ways that provide stayers and returners with just the kinds of skills and abilities that they will need to compete in a modern economy. There are linkages with high schools and community colleges, but they are exclusively to get college credit. So the idea is that, again, it's for those who are on the track for a 4-year degree. Why not use those same linkages but imagine it differently and sort of say, well, how can we reach those who are not on track for a 4-year college degree, have no real interest, maybe just don't have the academic preparation for that, and again, sort of linking them up with those kinds of skills that are needed. Also, this is the one that has incited a lot of negative reaction in the Heartland, is we really believe that small towns should, where possible, embrace immigration, and embrace it in such a way that immigration is done correctly. The phenomenon of Hispanic boomtowns, as I'm sure most people are aware, fundamentally and rapidly transforms local economies, but done wrong, if the non-native population isn't integrated, if their arrival, as was what's happened in Storm Lake and Postville and other places in Iowa, Mason City, also their arrival signals the sort of depression of wages in meat packing and other industries, because big ag they'll use undocumented workers to pay them $5 an hour, and actually the average wage in meat packing is about a third now as what it was 15 years ago. So this has actually happened, but there are ways around that. But doing immigration correctly is something that, again, and I'm happy to expand upon that in Q&A. One of the other things in terms of linking, part of the difficulty with sort of revamping education is getting bureaucracies that normally operate independently of one another to really talk to one another. Part of what can facilitate this is developing regional planning bodies, and that's already happening in places like Newton, Iowa. Dick Longworth's analysis of Caught in the Middle, he advocates very strongly for that. I think the idea is a sound one, and it's one that already in some places seems to be paying off. Preparing supports for veterans returning, as I said, just to return to some of the seekers. We spoke with people who had served in the military, and for many, they felt extraordinarily let down that all of the things that they had learned, the skills that they were promised, that if they, you do this in the military, when you come out, you're going to be able to use that to get a job. Most of them can't. So, for example, one young woman was a naval nurse, and none of her qualifications, her skills that she learned in the Navy are fungible towards getting a nursing degree. So she has to start at square one. And these are some of the kinds of things that, really shouldn't happen, or at least you can imagine ways that can be done better. And part of that is preparing at the local level to bring people back. Using some of the stimulus funds to kickstart local renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. I'll return to those at the sort of macro level too, those policy ideas. But again, just thinking in ways in which, by its very nature, the green economy has to be decentralized, right? So why not in a small town? One of the things that Iowa and many other sort of hollowing out areas, more than half of the non-metro counties in Iowa have at least one medically underserved area. And this is a real crisis in a lot of places that is somewhat overlooked also. And part of that is trying to sort of think of ways in which you can bring doctors, dentists, healthcare professionals more generally back to small towns. One of the things to do, we think, is to prospectively identify. Towns are good at picking out achievers and good at sort of preparing them. Why not say, listen, if you're going to go and qualify in a medical field or qualify in a field that we are in dire need of in small towns, we'll pay your tuition for a professional school if you'll sign on for 10 years to come back. So again, I think it's something that it's a small investment that would pay off tremendously. Building a digital infrastructure, it's still pretty frustrating to be out there and not have access to broadband technology, to cell phones and signals and so forth. And this is again something that's fairly simple, not just to encourage people to come back, but to make life better for those who stay. Some of the macro level changes very quickly. We believe that the investment from federal government level and alternative energy should be upped, and is something that, again, as I said, by its nature can be decentralized. We also believe that the time is right when we're not alone in this. Michael Pollan has argued much more eloquently and persuasively about changing how we produce food. Part of the reason that food is produced by big ag and mega farms is that they've been let do what they want. They've received a lot of favoritism from both federal and state policies, and maybe the time is to end that and to sort of think in ways in which we can alter how we produce food. Just as a personal note, as a lifelong urbanite, when we lived in Iowa, I grew things that I didn't know I could grow, and when I came back to Philadelphia, I thought I was the greatest gardener / vegetable producer in the world, and figured out that it wasn't me, it was the rich soil that was there. So if I can grow stuff there, organically, then pretty much anybody can, because I don't have any green digits at all. Also, again, in terms of just changing how we produce food, some of the changes that need to happen in terms of big ag stranglehold is, and this again sort of parlays into the immigration stuff, workers should be allowed to organize. One of the sort of threats that big ag always says is, well, if you let workers organize, we're just going to ship everything overseas. Well, here's a newsflash: you really can't. If your crops and your cattle are in Iowa or in Kansas or in Missouri, then that's where you have to be, right? So allowing workers organized does several things. One, it takes the funk away from immigration, because then it's not the immigrants that are driving down our wages. It was big ag who drove down your wages. You then make those jobs better for everybody. And the other thing that is incredibly deplorable about, especially meatpacking in Iowa, is just the deplorable state of health and safety. The plant in Postville that was the subject of the raid, they had 157 health and safety violations in the previous 18 months. That's a scandal, but again, when you're talking about undocumented workers, who really cares, right? So these are some things that have to happen. Changing immigration policy, moving away from interdiction. The raid in Postville cost $7.3 million and counting since they did it. You basically have destroyed a town, you've spent millions of dollars to do it, and you've disrupted families. Kids are U.S. citizens, the parents are not, and created what exactly, you know. So again, moving away from that to something that is more inclusive and again something, again, pathways to citizenship, as I'm sure in some ways speaking to the choir. And then finally, continuing the support along the lines of the American Graduation Initiative, which has allocated $12 billion for community colleges. This has to be a step in the right direction, but it has to be also accompanied with sort of rethinking what our community colleges can do. Finally, Richard Russo is much more eloquent and a much better writer than I'll ever be. You know, he sort of chronicles small towns, and he sort of says in the end, really it is the sort of story of those who stay and those who leave. And he says, you know, those who leave have a ghost version of themselves who can be found sitting at the bar watching the long neck bottles of beer lined up sweating in front of you. And for those who stay, small town life becomes a place where people are hanging on to home and hanging on to pride and hanging on by a thread. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was just excellent. Now I'd like to invite Phil Longman to come up and spend a few minutes responding, and then we'll have your questions.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I just want to say right off that I very much enjoyed reading your book. It stirred a lot of emotions. My dad and his dad have their roots in Iowa. It's a storied place in my family history. I want to just, in the brief time I have, concentrate on two aspects. One you already mentioned, which is agriculture, and one you didn't, which is transportation. If we go back 100 years or so and look at where the centers of economic power were in the United States, it was much less coastal and much more centered on cities like St. Louis, right, Kansas City. These were places that had their own operas, exchanges, rich people, culturally diverse. Today, they've become flyover zones. And I think a big part of the story of what has been going on in the hollowing out of America has a lot to do with railroads and how different railroads are in how they foster economic development as opposed to airlines or trucks. If we were sitting here in Dubuque, Iowa, even 50 years ago, we could go down to the train station in the evening and there'd be sleeper cars set out, and the next morning we could be in Chicago or Minneapolis or St. Louis, ready to do business. Same thing with if we were small businessmen, need to make parcel post deliveries to customers through the Railroad Express Agency. We would have tremendous logistical advantage. In fact, logistical advantage exceeding that of, say, New York City, because you're part of a network. You're, as an intermediate stop, you're served just as well as if you're at the end of some network. You can imagine if today you were in Iowa City and you could get on a train and be in Chicago in 3 hours. That's not so far-fetched. Because I have my roots in Iowa, I know about the Rocky Mountain Rocket and the Rock Island Railroad, and I know how to look up the timetable from 1949. And in 1949, you could get on a train in Iowa City and be in Chicago in 4 hours, right? And that's a train that never went more than 79 miles an hour. So with today's technology, we could effectively bring Iowa City as close to Chicago as Philadelphia is to Washington. And what would that mean for the creative class view of Iowa City? Because if you look on a map of the Middle West, you know, it was overwhelmingly developed by railroads at a time when they had steam engines, and steam engines could only go about 100 miles before they had to re-water and re-coal, right? So wherever that was, that's where the town came, right? So this geography, this industrial base was built by rail. I think it can be largely rebuilt by rail, not just freight. I mean, not just passenger, but freight. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is agriculture. And here, I think it's we very quickly get into all kind of cultural war stuff if we don't find exactly the right way to talk about it. Because we've got a whole bunch of people who don't know very much about farming or don't know what they don't know, and who will tell you all about the evils of Monsanto and industrial paradigm agriculture. And a lot of times they're right, but they project an attitude that to the Iowa farmer is incredibly offensive, right? Now, again, 100 years ago, we had a progressive movement in which the populist heartland and the Professor Tweezers at Johns Hopkins and the Northeast elite, they were all one politically. We didn't have a blue-red state divide. You know, we had a divide between progressives and reactionaries. And today's red states were some of the most progressive states there were. We got to get back to that, and part of what we have to do to get there is to start talking in a somewhat new vocabulary, including about food. And one of the things I want to say is there is a pragmatic case for, call it what you want, organic farming, regenerative farming, sustainable farming. The industrial paradigm farming is no longer producing the increase in crop yields that it did in the 70s and 80s. All right, that paradigm is pretty much played out. We've got a shifting consumer demand for food that's produced by alternative methods. We've got advances in techniques. This summer I toured Rodale Institute's demonstration farm in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, where for 30 years now they've been farming on 16-foot strips, where one strip they do whatever the local agricultural extension agent says, and on the next strip they plant the same crop using more or less traditional but modernized techniques of building humus in the soil. And they are now to the point where they're beating the yields on industrial agriculture in corn and wheat, particularly in drought years, because when you get that much humus in the soil, it's like a sponge, doesn't dry up, very few off-farm inputs, right? No pesticides, no herbicides, tremendous biodiversity in the soil. Now, I think there's a lot of small-scale farmers, and not so small-scale farmers, but ones with big debts, who would just love to be able to find a way to get away from the Monsanto contract, right? This is a natural alliance politically. And the other thing about it that's sort of cool is that a lot of these problems we have in societies, you can identify them easily enough, but what policy level would you do? Well, when it comes to agriculture, the whole thing is subsidized, right? So there's policy levers everywhere, right? For example, and this again, expanding the possible coalitions between urban and rural. Turns out, when you use no-till farming and when you don't use chemical nitrogen, when you instead use organic sources of nitrogen, that over time you build up organic material in the soil, and what you're doing in effect is sequestering enormous amounts of carbon. So much so that if every farm in America used the techniques that Rodale Institute does, their estimate is, and I think it's credible, that that in itself would sequester 40% of all the carbon dioxide output we make every year. And you think, like, what else could we do at a stroke that would sequester that much carbon? How many people would you have to get out of their cars or stop flying? Or how many coal-fired plants would we have to get rid of? So what I'm saying in effect is, in the next farm bill, which should be called the next food bill, and maybe the next air bill, we can look for a new paradigm where in part what we're doing is paying people to sequester carbon, right? Which has the effect of turning them into either conservationists or organic farmers and paying them to do it. And organic farming by its nature, I think, lends itself more to small-scale production units than the bigger stuff. It's fully mechanical, but it requires a keener eye on the land than and one that has your grandchildren in mind, right? Than in standard industrial techniques. So there's so much more to talk about, and I hope we get a chance, but I just wanted to throw out those two ideas and sit down and listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. All right. Two excellent presentations here. A number of questions are in my own mind, but I think at this point I'm going to open it up for your questions too, and we'll see where it all goes. You all just stay where you are, and you got the mics ready to go. We've got Danny. We've got a microphone here, and if you have a question, you might raise your hand. We'll start here with the lady. Please identify yourself, the organization, if you represent one, and please keep your question brief so that we can include a number of them.
Okay, my name is Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician. My question is for the author. The politics. I mean, this was a very objective presentation, but it turns out the coasts are blue, and as you mentioned, the internal part, the flyover part, is red. And I was wondering if you had noticed what the connection was. I mean, are they red because it's they're depressed? I mean, not emotionally depressed, because the situation, they're economically depressed. But red places tend to resist government initiatives and sociological stuff. And I wondered what the politics were in these places, if they had politics.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Obviously, Iowa is a very diverse political state, so I'm interested, Patrick, in your observations.
Okay, well, there's. I'll try and do the simple, not multi-layered response to the question. It's a great question, and Tom Frank has written, What's the Matter with Kansas? I mean, which I think you're referring to, where you vote against your interest because you're sold, the culture war stuff, and then by the way, big business is going to ruin your life, but you signed on for that because we promised you there'd be no abortion and so on, right? So, Iowa is politically very diverse. It's a blue state. I don't think President Obama would be President Obama if he hadn't won the caucus. So the county we were in went blue, which really surprised me, because there is a certain sense that there is we've been called coastal elitists. My paymasters at Rutgers must have been thrilled when I was referred to as an Ivy League elitist, which I'd gotten a promotion to the Ivy League. But anyway, there is a sense. I think first, in terms of the research, the people most likely to stay are those who don't talk about diversity as something that they want. So one of the things that the achievers and many of the seekers talk about was, I want to get out there because the world is so diverse and I want to experience it. One kid talked about going to college at Iowa, and he said, I had black roommates, and they have whole different things they do with their hair, and I was so amazed. And then he kind of stops for a minute, and he says, not everybody's Lutheran. So that was his experience, like, oh my God, the world is so different. And so you have consequently then many who stay are those who are not necessarily. It's just that their world is their world. They're happy with it. They don't really want change. So I think you're right. There is the sense that there is a more conservatism, and certainly more a fear of change. But at the same time, I think, I went back to this small town where, when you write about anybody, there's going to be pushback. And I went into this packed little library, and everybody was lined up, and they were all arms folded, looking like this, So I had a script. I just threw the script out. I said, this is not going to work. I can't talk. I have to just speak to them. So I said, look, here's the situation. You're not in terrible shape, but this is a problem. If you don't talk about this problem, if you don't think about ways in which you can solve this problem, then your town won't exist in 15 years. So you can kill the messenger, or you can begin to think about ways in which things can be better. And I think when you put it in those kinds of terms, I think people are certainly are more open to having that conversation. And I think that's really where you start. It's not going to be easy, but I think things are bad enough in enough places that you have to think beyond. You can easily be distracted by culture war stuff. We all can, because there are hot button issues that we'll all get on whatever side you're on. But I think that when you put it in terms of, look, that stuff is a distraction. The real issue here is your town going to be on this map in 20 years? Then I think that people are more open to political, at least difference, or at least different ideas. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, gentleman here.
How you doing? My name is Marcus Skelton from the American Association of State Colleges. I had two questions. The first one is, has the three groups of people, has that been applied to like an urban setting, or has there been a study done on that? And the second question is, as far as you mentioned a number of policies to get people to stay, would you recommend any policies to get new people to come into rural America as far as building the workforce that way instead of just holding on to what the people currently there?
Two great questions. The short answer about the urban application of those groups to urban is no, but you can see how, particularly in Bill Wilson's work, when you talk about the flight of the middle class from the inner city and so on, there are those striking parallels. So I think it might work as much there, but again, if you're talking about urban areas, you're talking about neighborhoods rather than towns, if you know what I mean. So the dynamic is somewhat different in a metro area, and particularly if your neighborhood's doing badly, but if there are jobs, a bus right away, it's a lot different than a town that's about to go out of existence. But you're right about that. Bringing new people in, absolutely. There are as many policies as you could think of. I mean, I think, give you a couple of for instances. State of Iowa has an ongoing sort of recruitment effort to bring professional people back. At one stage, it was called the "Come Back to Iowa, Please" campaign, because they're very polite. You see, so if you ask the question nicely, then they spent a lot of money on this, and they had these wonderful ads where they featured these real people who had come back, and so they had these taglines: Iowa, the 6th safest state in the nation. Iowa, where your commute can be measured in minutes, and so on. So they're trying, but most of the efforts are the kind of packages of incentives. So it's land is cheaper, we'll give you startup money, we'll give you this, we'll give you that, and the strange thing about, even if you look at these ads of the people who come back, when you read their biographies, even the sort of selective pieces that they show in these ads, they're coming back because they were born there or they have family there, and so on. They're coming back to raise their kids. So they're coming back for really personal reasons and not for the incentive. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to do that. What is working is, and there are net gainers in non-metro America, the counties, the non-metro counties in the Midwest that gained population at the same time all these places lost, are all of those places that are retirement destinations. So retirees are coming back to certain places. So where natural amenities are great, or where there's hunting and fishing and things like that, you do see towns that are robust in areas that are gaining population. And that's great, but the only thing I would say about that is that you need to balance that out with the younger people, again, to keep your schools and your local institutions going.
Bill, do you want to add anything about Joel's work, or anything else that you see about incentives for the Heartland?
Well, I was actually on the internet last night looking at homestead properties in Marne, Iowa, and I thought it was kind of strange how they presented themselves. They have on their website, Marne, Iowa.
It's free land, right?
Huh?
It's a free land program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you go, I guess I would take Marne to be a city of maybe 500 people. It's laid out on a little city plat. And what they're offering you is you can go there and get a free city lot. They'd like to call it a city lot. It's platted, right? And they'll give it to you free on condition that you stay there for, I think, 2 years. They encourage you to bring your children, and they want you to build a house, right? And I was thinking about that sort of in terms of my wanderlust. It's like, well, you know what? That doesn't quite work for me, because I could go there and build this house, but how would I make a living, right? So I wondered, like, well, why not plots of like 30 acres, right, where you have a little hobby farm, which could appeal to a lot of retirees, but also to small-scale organic producers who are going to be selling jam on eBay and other stuff like that, right? Seems a whole lot more practical.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, how we did it originally.
Sure. Sure. Further questions here? Go here and then gentleman in yellow.
Hi, I'm Mike Olshausen. The title of Bringing Back Rural America somehow seems to me like an effort to get water to roll uphill or to flow uphill. In many parts of the country, these rural small towns, if you want to buy shoes, you'll go to a national franchise store. If you want to buy groceries, you go to a rather large grocery store. It might be a Kroger, it might be, I don't know, Safeway or something like that, but it'll be some entity which is associated with ownership that's not in the area. And this is true of the big box stores, and on, many franchise operations, even plumbing franchise operations. And so you have all these little pumps operating, and they extract profit, and they don't bring it back. And that's not going to go away, at least not in the United States anytime soon. It seems to me that unless you have profit made locally, invested more or less locally in some rough sense, it needn't be in that particular locality, but at least in a state sense. If you have these wealth pumps operating to the advantage of investors, wouldn't live in these places if their lives depended on it, it's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, any reflections on that?
Well, you're right about, Main Streets, bringing back Main Streets is one of the more difficult things. We've thought about this, and it's been, again, probably the best way to illustrate this is with an anecdote. Since we published the book, people have been getting in touch with us, and this one young woman, Sarah Goodrum, was in touch from Kansas, and she's from a town, I think it's Ellsworth in Kansas. It's in the sort of northwestern part of the state, and she said she was doing a project, about our town for her MA. So she stood on her main street 2 Saturdays before Christmas in 2006 for 3 hours, and she met one person. And she said it was like a Twilight Zone episode, because the bank had this piped Christmas music that was piped outside, so it was kind of echoing off this empty street. I don't know what you do to bring back main streets, and I think you're onto something in terms of what can you do to those who are making money hand over fist. Like, for example, the people in Ellis do most of their shopping 45 miles away. There's a Walmart, and that's where they go. The local pharmacy shut its doors 15 months ago. Absolutely, that's one of the more intractable things, and I'm just not. We have a room full of people who probably know more about these issues than I do. I'm not sure how you bring them back.
Former industrialists who made out quite well. Even in that town, on the beautiful Delaware River, they had everything going for it. Mm-hmm. Same phenomenon. Yeah. They just can't make it work on Main Street.
Mm-hmm. It's an important point. Thank you, sir. Gentleman in yellow.
My name's Will Kinder. I work at the Children's Defense Fund, but recently moved to Washington from Montana. And I'm curious about whether you've given any thought to what similarities or differences might exist between a town like Ellis and communities on American Indian reservations.
I haven't thought about it. I would think that some of the very same forces are at work. It's an area I would be speaking out of ignorance. I really don't know that much about towns on the reservation, but I would think that, they're affected by the same sort of local and macro issues, I would think. One of the I think there's this universal sort of, again, there are people who do very well and who leave the reservation and who go off to college and in many ways don't come back. And again, I know a little bit about some of the Jesuit schools in South Dakota, because actually one of the research assistants on this project is actually working there now. She ended up there and she's been there for 4 years. And the story that she tells about that settlement there is very similar to Ellis. So I would think that the parallels are there. I just don't know enough about the dynamics to be able to speak knowledgeably about it.
How many more questions do we have, just as we sort of think about it? Okay, I'm going to start doubling up questions here since we've got quite a few. So let's, just on the lights in my eyes. Why don't you take one there with the lady, and then Danny, why don't you just pick someone else in the back, and we'll have two. Start doubling.
I'm Marcy McLaughlin. I'm with the Rural Policy Research Institute, and you have a lot of people in here who you're giving art speech. So I guess this is confirmation that you're right on. I'm also curious because it looks to me like there's a room full of folks who may have been in one of your categories or another, those that left small towns. So just a quick show of hands for those who are from rural in this age bracket would be very helpful to this conversation, and particularly as we continue it.
Yeah, all right. Let's think about second question back there. How many people are from? I'm from outside Dayton, Ohio. How many folks are from some small town or some medium-sized town? Or all right, okay, cool. Actually, it's probably a definitional issue. What is your definition of a small town? It'd be interesting to sort of see.
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Michelle Manat. I'm with the Council of the Americas. I want to congratulate you on the work, Patrick, and your co-author. I look forward to reading it in depth. I wanted to ask you if you can play out a little more the issue of getting immigration right. If there are any positive examples, Postville and the outrage that continues to go on there, the impacts, something that's very well known thanks to all of our friends in the media. But the question is, where have things gone right, or where would there be one or two or several examples of where things are even incipient that should be nurtured? Thank you.
Okay, great.
I think I'm up to parlay on that question. So.
Do you want to take a third one here? We sort of got the show of hands a little bit.
Oh, well, I was going to give an example of a place where things had gone right.
Great.
You want to hear it?
Yes, please.
Janet Topolsky, Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group. We do work all over in communities, urban and rural, but a lot of work in rural. As one example, there are communities, rural communities, that have embraced immigration. Pelican Rapids, Minnesota. Let me just give you one. Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, population, I don't know. It's under 5,000, I think. And they have, in their grade school, they have students coming in speaking 12 different languages. I mean, these are not only Latino immigrants, they're Eastern European, they're African, Somali, all over. And the reason is because it's a turkey processing plant. And the reason is because they got on one of these wonderful beneficial pipelines from through religious congregations that started bringing immigrants in. And at one point, the town just sat down and said, well, what are we going to do about this? And they've embraced it. They've redone their culture. They've built new welcoming centers. They've got all sorts of stuff going on because they realize that immigrants are a new engine for the economy. So you could go into a lot of detail about what they've done, but it's a matter of the community sitting down and saying. So communities can do it on their own without changing federal policy.
Thank you for adding that example. Let's take one more question, and then Patrick can comment on the next question or this broader immigration one.
James Dunlop. I'm wondering what appetite there is for this level of funding, because you're talking about transport links that will cost billions of dollars to put in, and tech infrastructure that maybe not the same level of cost, but still it's a lot of money. What appetite is there federally and at the state level for putting that sort of money in?
Okay. So any comments more broadly on immigration, let's just stop here for a second, or on the practicality of some of these investments that would be necessary to transform some of the infrastructure in other areas?
I think in terms of immigration, I've heard of Pelican Rapids, and I'm glad. Thank you for the information on that. Lewiston, Maine's another one that has been very successful. Again, mainly with, I think, African refugees there. But again, and I think you're right. I mean, I think in terms of the Iowa situation, part of what needs to change is certainly the federal policy. But what is really significant is the actions of local churches and other, sort of local institutions in being very proactive with respect to immigration. And where they have been, it's been a much different story than in Postville or Storm Lake or Mason City. And one of the groups that this group of nuns, the Southern Mississippi, I can't even remember what they have an acronym anyway, but there's this one nun, Sister Hilary Milani, and even though I was beaten up by nuns when I was a child, some of them are actually good, apparently. No, to be fair. they raised their own money to put ads on the radio and to buy print ads when there was a real anti-immigration push in Iowa several years back. And one of the ads they did was really, really slick, I thought. They had this billboard, and it was like a Polaroid picture of an extended Latino family, so grandparents, parents, and children, and one of the sort of this little baby child, sort of almost like in christening robes. And the tagline was "Welcome the immigrant you once were," which I thought was, again, very, very smart. And there are insurgent efforts that are there. I'd like to see them supported more, certainly, but I also think that some of the larger policies have to change.
Let's see. We've got a couple more. Phil, you got a comment here real quick?
Well, on the immigration, I mean, I was quite moved by your account of that story, but not in a good way. Because, when I read that in your book, I thought, let's be real about what's talking about. The immigrant you once were was some German farmer, Swedish farmer who got a ticket on a steamer and responded to a railroad advertisement for developed land, and you came over there and you set up a small place and you had 8 kids and you integrated in the community with other people and you built a little county courthouse and all that, right? That is a whole lot different than a young man from Mexico who slips in to work in a packing place that busts the union, and it's just different in kind, totally. And 100 years ago, people would have spent a lot of time talking about concepts like yeomanry and the importance of property ownership and building. And we got to just be sure that we don't, out of political correctness, gloss all over that, because, like what you're saying, Storm Lake and such, it's threatening, it's divisive, and it really hurts on the blue-red state when people on the coast just don't seem to get the legitimate concerns of folks that have there.
It underscores the complexity of immigration reform these days. This is a great discussion. We're getting closer on time now. I'm going to suggest we take 3 questions. I'm going to take 3 hands here. 1, 2, and give me a third one here. We'll start with the person holding the microphone, then we'll go to the lady in green and then in blue. And then apologies, we're out of time, but perhaps we can talk a bit afterwards. So 3 final questions stacked, and then we'll let our 2 speakers respond as they wish.
Great, thank you. My name is Noelle Ellerson. I'm with the American Association of School Administrators. I want to thank you for some of the findings you had on the importance of schools and what schools are doing, especially educating all the children. And we recently surveyed our rural network looking at the issues of recruitment and retention, and it corroborates everything you've said, and more to the point, how likely it is that students, especially teachers, are very likely to take their first teaching position within 100 miles of where they grew up in a very like-minded community. So that has a lot of implications for how you staff your schools. But separate from that, I was hoping you would expand on the point that you kind of went through briefly around broadband and the issue of deployment, especially in light of the national broadband plan that's being considered and the implications that will have for both schools and communities as they work around mobilizing or expanding broadband, especially in rural communities.
Okay, that's a great question. We'll have the lady in green here.
Thanks. My name is Michelle Williams. I really like some of your proposals for remedying the situation, and I was wondering, since due to globalization, this brain drain of rural communities is happening all over the world, has been happening all over the world for a while now. So I'm wondering if possibly the authors have looked at solutions that other people in other countries have found to counter this, and then related to that, as far as going to other countries and traveling, it's very disappointing to me that people tend to think, or maybe others inform them, that the only way to just kind of have an adventure overseas and then come back is the military. There are lots of ways to do that without being part of the military-industrial complex. Service organization, international and national service organizations. Unfortunately, the Peace Corps is somewhat elitist, so you have to have a college degree to do that, but there are plenty of other organizations that you can join that where you actually do have applicable skills when you come back, such as organizing, being resourceful, maybe starting a small business co-op or something. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll take the final question. Lady in the blue.
I don't really have a question. This has been a fascinating, very brief discussion, and I'd love to see New America have a full day of a conference on this topic. Brings in umpteen threads. I mean, Mr. Longman just mentioned a few. I grew up in Appalachia, and the problem of Appalachia is very applicable to the problem of the Midwest. And, you know, there are no good solutions. And so we need our best minds really coming together to think about this.
I appreciate that. Let me just respond to that quickly, because I have been heartened by the response both of your book, Patrick, and also to this event and other piece of work that you and Joel, that Phil and Joel and others have worked on. So let me think on that. Well, I want Patrick to have the last word. We have two questions that are on the floor, one on broadband more broadly and then on global application solutions, examples, and opportunities. Anything you want to respond to, Phil, or comment on before Patrick brings us on?
On the global part, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the story of the world, basically. We're now at the point where we've just become the point where half the world's population lives in cities. But it's not working out so great in particularly Africa. And I would draw your attention to the work of the World Bank in their latest World Economic Prospects report, which for the first time from that institution I ever heard, they basically said to Africans, teaming into megacities where there's no jobs and lots of disease vector isn't working out so well, so why don't you all go out and be organic farmers? That's basically what they said. And I think I have a piece in Foreign Policy magazine about the return of yeomanry, which is talking about how this is beginning to happen on a world scale. We're seeing in India, these mass suicides of farmers there who've basically, sort of played out the industrial paradigm to its end. And I think there's a growing realization that small-scale agriculture really is a route to economic development, not just in the Midwest, but in the third world, too.
Thank you, Phil. Patrick, the last word on.
Oh, very quickly, the first question on broadband. I think having a broadband or more broadly digital infrastructure will actually facilitate some of the things we talk about in terms of the linkages with community colleges, particularly in areas that are remote from them. Again, what's to stop a high school senior taking an online course that again can build skills? I think that can only help, and I think the notion often is let's build a digital infrastructure and bring people back, but I say build it for everybody who's there anyway, because it's an amenity that can only do good things. Secondly, about the solutions around the world, we really didn't focus that much on it, and I'm intrigued by your idea of there have been other ways to see the world other than the military. I think part of that is just it would be nice if there was recruiters for things other than the military that show up at these high schools, but there aren't. I mean, they do, and it's a very powerful, for a volunteer army. I mean, I'll just give you, for instance, this young man was there, about to enlist in the National Guard, and he's 17. It's the fall of his high school senior year, and we're there with the recruiter. We actually got to sit in on this, and so we were asking him, so where are you going? I says, serve my country, family tradition, and so no, why are you going? And so he says, well, my girlfriend's pregnant, we're buying a house, so you're going to have a baby and then you're going to leave, or you're going to leave before you have your first child. And he says, okay, I'm going for the money. So the recruiter who's listening to the conversation, so he said, how much money? It's $20,000 over so many years, then tuition when you come back. So I think the incentives are there for these guys that just aren't for other things, and it's just a question of again imagining other things. I don't think many of these young people who go into the military can imagine other things. I think it's been able to do that.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Let me just follow up on one last thing here. I'm heartened by this turnout and this interest, and I think this isn't a topic worth following up on. If there are other researchers or even foundations that would be interested in being involved in a broader effort, obviously you guys are interested in this topic, you might email me at gray@newamerica.net with other partners that we might involve if we're going to do something more broadly on this important topic, because I do think it's worth considering again. I wanted to thank you for coming, and I ask that you please join me in thanking Patrick Carr and Phil Longman. Patrick's book is out here. And have a great day.
Thanks.